All right. Stress. Yes, this is what I study. I study stress. I set my slides to be loaded. Apparently, no one ever loaded them. So, I think I'll just talk. I have some really pretty pictures which I can show people, but anyhow. So, I have the unenviable task of trying to combine three disparate problems, which is stress and suicide, but end with something positive, because we didn't want you to go away and be bummed out, right? So I'm ending with wisdom. Now, how can I do this? Well, it's very simple, really. Is that, it's an ill wind that blows no good. That stress, okay, that stress has terrible effects, right? Or it can have terrible effects. Right? We know that stress is associated with all sorts of different types of morbidity and mortality, and we know that older people are at risk for physical stressors, or greater vulnerability to physical stressors. And that's for a number of reasons. Older people have chronic illnesses, right? They have a harder time regulating their homeostasis. So when you get a heat shock or a heat wave, they're more likely to die. If you look at natural disasters, older adults, who dies? It's the very young and the very old. So 80% of the people in Katrina who died were over the age of 65. And most of the folks who died in the Paradise Fire in California last year were over the age of 65. They had mobility problems, they couldn't get out, they had cognitive problems, they didn't have the oxygen they needed, they didn't have the medication they needed, okay? So we know that older adults are at greater risk for physical stress, okay? But it's a big question as to whether or not they're actually at risk for psychological stress. And I've been studying the normative aging study men, which is a sample mainly of World War II and Korea-era vets, since 1985. And we have all this wonderful data I was going to show you on what happens to stress, right? So, as Karen mentioned so eloquently, there's myths that we think that older people are isolated, lonely, demented, cognitively impaired, disabled, and just a mess, right? Grumpy old men, right? If you look at what happens to stress, however, what happens is that actually stressful life events decrease over the lifespan. And that's using the measure that I did to show that, to look at events that are more common to older adults, like institutionalization of parent or spouse, things like this, right? Hassles decrease as well, your daily stressors, which makes no sense. I've talked to 80-year-old men that I know had hypertension and needed a cane to walk, and they said, oh, I had no problems in the past week or the past month, right? Now, so why do older people report less stress? Some of it is that with the decrease in social roles, if you're not working, guess what? No more work stress. Yay, right? If you're not actively parenting, you don't have to deal with the teenage tantrums, right? And our data shows that you can, you substitute things like fixing your garage or door, finally, right? But it's not as bad. Now, health-related hassles do increase. But in general, older adults report less psychological stress than younger adults. Okay. But it's important to remember that there are huge individual differences in response to stress. And older adults a lot of older adults handle stress better. As Karen mentioned, they're better at emotion regulation, they're better at solving interpersonal problems, they're better at keeping perspective, right? If you look at even things like 9/11, older adults are less likely to perceive this, or perceive it as less stressful than young adults, right? They have perspective from having gone through a lot of stuff in their life. And finally, older adults do more proactive coping, right? If you talk to folks, they'll do things like go to the airport the day ahead of time so they know where they're going, right? Wonderful study in San Francisco of 80-year-olds a number of years ago showed that older adults spent a lot of time like plotting a route so they didn't have to make a left-hand turn in San Francisco, which is taking your life in your hands, right? Or they would do things like go to the Safeway out by the beach so they could get a ride back, right? So, most older adults are pretty good at coping. But there's some older adults who get into trouble, right? So this is my suicide part of this. Right? Now, I have a beautiful, beautiful slide that shows that across the world, men are much more likely to commit suicide than women. They're twice as likely. With a couple of exceptions, China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, right? Very patriarchal cultures I can talk about where women are really dependent upon their husbands for sustenance, and if their husbands die, there's no way for them to live, right? So, the other thing to realize is that suicides are largely a problem of old white men, right? Older men over the age of 65 are 4 times more likely to commit suicide in the United States than the average person, right? It's been increasing. High rates are especially over the age of 75. Now, women's suicide rates have also been increasing, but they're peaking in midlife for some interesting reasons that I don't have time to get into now, right? But 70% of all suicides in the US in the past year were committed by white men, right? White older men. And the question is, why? Right? It's an amazing statistic, and it's not as well known as it should be, right? So you can look at the traditional epidemiological type risk factors that David and other folks have talked about. So having 2 or more chronic illnesses, being depressed or abusing alcohol, social isolation, bereavement. The sort of joke among the gerontologists back in Boston is that once men are bereaved, they either get married in the next year or they die, right? So, and that's actually some truth to that. But there are other reasons that are harder to measure in surveys that that I think are in some ways even more important. Okay, one of which is autonomy. And Fisk talks about this a lot. That one of the problems with aging is that you start dealing with problems that are sort of uncontrollable, right? That, and in my dissertation, I got my dissertation chair very mad at me because I was trying to look at how personality and values affect people's stress and coping, right? And I had all these ideas of what was happening. But what I found was that people's values affected the type of stress for men only, whereas the values and personality affected women's coping strategies. Now, these are middle-aged men and women, middle class, from many decades ago, right? And so I couldn't figure out why, right? And so what I did was to go back to the interviews. Because qualitative data, we've talked a lot about the quantitative data today, but qualitative data can also tell you a lot. And what I found was that white males had positions of authority, right, and responsibility. They were largely management folks, and they got to choose which type of stressors they dealt with. I went back to the interviews. I said, I don't deal with crying babies. My wife does that, right? Or I don't like dealing with this type of problem at work, so I can give it to my assistant. They had a lot of autonomy, and they got to choose the types of problems they faced. The women, on the other hand, were mainly stay-at-home moms or had secretarial or Salesforce jobs, they didn't get to choose. They had to deal with the crying babies, right? They had to deal with the grumpy customers. They had to learn different types of coping strategies. So what got my dissertation chair angry at me was I said, older men aren't learning how to cope with uncontrollable stress. And when they get to late life, they don't have the skill sets that you need to deal with problems. And in support of that, right, the big increase in suicides you see among older white men, you do not see in older black men or older Hispanic men. They've learned to deal with uncontrollable stressors, right? So that's one thing. Second thing that is harder to measure, but sometimes people just think it's their time, right? That it's people in their 90s, they've outlived their spouse, their families, they start outliving their children, right? And so maybe what they do is very simply stop taking their medications or stop eating and drinking. And so I suspect that suicide is actually underreported. And I suspect that women are more likely to just stop taking their meds or stop eating. There's a woman in my neighborhood 2 months ago. I saw her, she was okay, she was out, she was walking, and ran into a neighbor and said, well, she decided she was done, so she just stopped eating. And then she stopped drinking, and she was dead in a month, right? The ancient Romans called this ars, or in the Middle Ages, they call it ars moriendi, the art of dying well, choosing your time when you're done. The Irish call it a good death. And lastly, there's something called altruistic suicide that Durkheim talked about over 100 years ago. That sometimes older men, when facing diagnoses such as dementia, do not want to bankrupt their families, right? Dementia care is $10,000 to $12,000, $14,000 a month. The average middle-class family can maybe support that for maybe a year, if that. They don't want to leave their wives destitute. They want to leave something for their kids. And so they choose, and you can't get physician-assisted suicide if you have dementia or depression, right? So they choose not to be a burden, right? It's hard to study that. But then what does wisdom have to do with it, right? Well, one of the things that stress forms a context for possible development in adulthood, right? So if you have stress that shatters your worldview, that challenges your meaning of something, then you have the opportunity to actually develop the 3 C's, character, courage, right? And so one of the things that can develop is wisdom. And there's a lot of different ways. I've got a great slide showing a guy holding a baby bear, a cub, with the mama bear behind him. I mean, we're really good at knowing what wisdom isn't, right? We're not so good at knowing what wisdom is. But there are 2 basic models, and one you could call practical knowledge that Baltus talks about, which is how do you get things done? What's your knowledge base? What's your procedural knowledge? Can you tolerate uncertainty? And the other, Aristotle called that phronesis. The other one is Sophia, which is wisdom, which is self-development. And Kurnow and our lab has developed a model, which is actually not that dissimilar from youth development, where we talk about self-knowledge, not just knowing what you like and what you don't like, but really, where do you come from? What shaped you? What are your goals? Where do your goals come from? Do they come from you or from your family or from society, right? Non-attachment. We get stuck on things. We get addicted to things, not just drugs and alcohol and meth and crack and cocaine, but to cars and being beautiful and having lots of knowledge and having lots of money. And that gets you stuck. And it's very hard to develop, and especially if you get into a problem. I was down at Stanford one time. NIA wanted to get folks in the psychology department interested in aging research, so they brought in some of us to say, you need to do this. And the guys were telling me, I'm a Stanford professor. I can't possibly retire. Who else would I be? Right? They're so invested in one social role, and that they lose that social role, they're at sea. So becoming non-attached to things, which does not mean not caring about stuff, but being able to step back. If you can do that, then you can become integrated. Most of us are like little bundles of contradictory needs and desires. I need to lose 30 pounds, but you know, the chocolate cake looks really, really good, right? And so, but if you don't know who you are, and if you can't detach from who you think you are, then you can't really change. So if we become integrated, we could stop fighting ourselves. And lastly is self-transcendence. Being able to step back outside of your own needs and desires and look for purpose in life, look for goals, look for benefit to society, right? Look for something larger than yourself that gives meaning to your life. Because in the exception of maybe altruistic suicide, suicide is a lack of meaning, a lack of reason to get up and out of bed in the morning, right? And so what you want to try to develop is when things happen to you that are bad, is remember that it's actually an opportunity as well. And that you develop new coping skills, you develop new perspective through going through bad things in your life that can actually help you in late life. Thank you.